Tonight happens to be Chof Beis Shvat. So I'll tell you some Rebbetzin stories. The first is quite familiar, quite famous. It's been told many times. Obviously, the person who has given us this story is the Rebbetzin herself. That the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin were still in Paris when the Nazis entered Paris, I guess in June of 1940. They didn't stick around for very long. They very quickly departed for the south of France, where there was a puppet government, a Vichy government, which was a bit easier, at least for a time, for Jews. But they were actually in France when the Nazis initially entered the city. And of course, the story was that the landlady who owned the home where the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin rented an apartment came to the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin with good news. And she told them that the Nazis had come around looking for Jews. And they came to her as a landlady and asked her who lives in the building. And she identified the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin as Orthodox. Not as Jews, not as Orthodox Jews, but as Orthodox, which could have very easily meant Orthodox Eastern Christians. And the Rebbe went to the Nazi offices and registered as a Jew. This is the first story. And the second story, this story I heard only once from a person that I respect. I heard it many years ago. I wonder if the story is true, but it's a very interesting story. That the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin were walking, and there was some kind of a parade. I don't know if it happened in Berlin when the Nazis initially came to power or in Paris. And the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin were walking, and the Rebbetzin wanted to duck out of the way. And the Rebbe said, Zolni zizen via Yid gate. Let them see how a Jew walks. And they kept walking, and each one of the Nazi soldiers walked around them. If anybody has confirmation of this story, please let us know. But this is a story that I heard and that I believe. For an ordinary person to go in Nazi-occupied Europe and register as a Jew, or to march opposite the Nazi parade would have been suicide. But the Rebbe insisted on doing it because he's the Rebbe. And I tell these stories in light of the conversation we started last week that continues tonight. And that is that, although it's really true that Einoid Movade means there's nothing other than God, but there are a lot of levels of the manifesting of that. In other words, for some people, it may be true Einoid Movade, but you have to live within the limitations of nature. For other people, because Einoid Movade, living within the limitations of nature would constitute a compromise, a sin. Like it says in the Chassidishe, in the Maamar of Yeshiv, that Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph, sat in jail for 10 years. Then the Saramashkim and Saraifim, the butler and the baker, spent a year with him. The butler was released. The baker was hung. And before the butler departed, Yosef HaTzadik asked him to intercede on his behalf. And as the Pasuk says, V'lezocha Saramashkim et Yosef, the butler didn't remember Yosef, and he forgot him. And Rashi says that Yosef spent 2 more years in jail for the terrible crime of not trusting God. And of course the question is asked in the Maimorim, is it not true that when a person finds themselves in whatever situation, it's incumbent upon them to make some kind of a kli, some kind of a vessel in nature to accommodate the improvement of that situation? So what crime was there for Yosef to ask the butler to help him, which was a perfectly reasonable thing to do, considering the fact that he was stuck in a boyd, in a pit, and he didn't have rights to an attorney, it wasn't America, and so forth. And the Maimorim answered that for a tzaddik of that caliber, making a kli in teva constituted a sin. In other words, what for another person is a requirement, you must approach your life within the limitations of nature. In the case of Yosef HaTzadik, it constituted a sin. Now the context of this conversation is Avraham and Moshe. Avraham Avinu was a very big tzaddik. Moshe Rabbeinu was also a big tzaddik. But as the Maamar started teaching us last week, and last week we talked of Avraham Avinu, and with the help of God Almighty, tonight we'll talk of Moshe Rabbeinu. Avraham was a different level. Avraham's godliness was from Atzilus. Consequently, the Avraham that manifested in this world was much less than the Avraham Avinu in Atzilus. As it says in Eger Sakedesh, Tezva v'anoichi ofra ve'efa. You cannot compare the supernal Abraham to the actual Abraham. So although Avraham Avinu's mitzvahs made Yechudim on high, improved Atzilus, and it trickled down to some degree here, but Avraham Avinu had a certain limitation. In other words, he couldn't bring the same godliness that was his, that he was able to affect in Atzilus in the physical world. Moshe Rabbeinu was an altogether different level of tzaddik, and consequently, Moshe Rabbeinu was able to affect that Asiyah should be equal to Atzilus, literally. And that's why we spent so much time last week telling all these stories about tzaddikim whose perception or perspective of the real world is such that not only do they see godliness within the framework of their reality, they're not allowed to see anything other than godliness. The highest level of tzaddik is supposed to approach his life and his world with such a direct sense of the direct involvement of God Almighty that anything short of that constitutes a chet, at least a chet lashon chesaron. Let's get to the text. I'll tell you some stories later, okay? But let's read first. Line 24. V'hine, kol zeh hu inyan Avraham. Last week we talked about Avraham Avinu, explained that his influence was primary in Hatzilus. He did mitzvahs, Hashem did mitzvahs reciprocally, and so forth. And it trickled down to some measure, to some degree, in the lower worlds. Aval Moshe Rabbeinu olav hashalom, as opposed to his great-great-great-grandson Moshe Rabbeinu, him shirgam lamata bebri yitzir asiyah. He was in a position to bring godliness down to the lower worlds, and I think this means to say the same godliness that he brought into Atzilus, he brought into Asiyah. Because of course Chassidus explains, if something is true, it's absolute, and if it's absolute, it's all over, and all over equally. And if it's not all over the same, then it shows that it's not absolute. V'hainu, and the reason for this difference is, why was it that Avraham Avinu could not bring the same light of Atzilus to Asiyah, and Moshe could? Since Avraham Avinu is kindness in the world of Atzilus. Now, what is kindness in the world of Atzilus? It's infinite kindness, but it's infinite kindness only b'mkoimeh. In Chassidus, there's a discussion called Atzilus v'yein sof, or Atzilus v'yoyer. What's the difference between Atzilus and Oyer? Atzilus is Gili of Ein Sof. Ein Sof is also Ein Sof. What's the difference? And the difference, the language is Atzilus is a lakus b'mkoimeh. Atzilus can be infinite, and godliness only in Atzilus. When Atzilus light descends beneath Atzilus, it becomes confined, which proves that even while in Atzilus, it wasn't the highest level. As opposed to Oyer, or Ein Sof, Keser, because it's not limited to the Ein Sof of Atzilus, as it is on high, it descends below in kind. And that's what the next words say, Aval is chesed v'is chesed v'chulu. There is a kindness associated with the world, is chesed elam and chesed chesed. There's an infinite kindness. Chesed elam means chesed of Atzilus, that when it comes lamata, it becomes even more reduced. And Rav chesed, because it's from keser, doesn't change. And that's the difference between Moshe and Avraham. Avraham comes from Atzilus. So Atzilus is godliness only in Atzilus. And therefore, when Avraham comes down into this world, it's a circumstance of Anochi Afa Ve'efa, as opposed to Moshe. Or Moshe, as opposed to Moshe Rabbeinu, Kim Men Amayim V'Geim, when he was drawn from the water. And it's explained in Chassidus, this refers to Shemitah Rishena, the first sabbatical. Moshe Rabbeinu comes from Keser. We know that there's Tohu and Tikkun. Our world, our universe, our 6,000 or 7,000 year cycle of life is the second Shemitah, Tikkun. And Moshe Rabbeinu comes from the first, from Tohu, in other words, from Keser. And since he comes from the level of Oyer or Ein Sof, which is higher than Atzilus, to him, Atzilus and Asiyah are equal. Parenthesis, V'yesh b'zeh there are different opinions. Im Shemitah Shleima Shva Alfa Shnin, whether the first 7,000 years, the first sabbatical which is associated with Tehu actually was, or it's the world of Tehu which existed only in theory, that's called Shemitah, discussed in the writings of the Arizal. And my understanding is that the maskana of the Arizal is that all of the time frames, besides for hours, are metaphysical, are spiritual. The Rebbe has footnotes on this in many places, but I think also in the Rebbe's letter on Tchias HaMesim, he talks about this, that we know that there's Nun Allah from Liadi, there's 50,000 jubilees, and we are the second Shemitah of the first of those 50,000 Yavlis. So Tzemach Tzedek brings the mitzvah's tefillin from the Arizal, that all of the Yavlis except for ours are Ruchnias. In other words, Eilam HaTorah did not exist for 7,000 years, and the idea of Boinei Eilam Umachrivan, which is often cited by more modern Orthodox Jews who want to reconcile biblical creation with the scientific dating of the universe by saying that Boinei Eilam Umachrivan is a reference to earlier epochs or cycles of life, and the Rebbe objects to that by saying that in the Arizal's opinions, all time other than our 6,000 or 7,000 year cycle is metaphysical and not actual. So I'm not sure, but I think that this is when we talk about Havamin, this is a first thought which would later be refuted. Moshe Rabbeinu comes from Kesed, and he's brought down from Kesed into Atzilus, and from Atzilus into the lower worlds. I don't know how dedicated you are to these classes on doyeshiva.net, but I recall last year giving the class on Shmois. Misam Pelo Adam. Moshe says, how can I speak? I come from a world of wordlessness, transcendent of Atzilus. And God tells him, I know, but I'll give you words. And this is a similar notion. Moshe comes from Ein Sof and from Kesed, and consequently, Moshe Rabbeinu can relate to godliness in such a way that Atzilus and Asiyah should be the same. It was Moshe Rabbeinu who calls forth the Ein Sof, which is represented by Havaya, the two divine names, Havaya, which come before the 13 attributes of mercy. The Kol Yal Moshe was Moshe Rabbeinu calling forth Ein Sof. Shokar of him Shech, he has the power to call forward and to bring down Mimazoles from Kesed, Lihiyes Abba da Atzilus, to create Chochma of Atzilus from Kesed. She'Abba Yenik Mimazaleches v'chuli, according to Kabbalah, Chochma is sustained by Neitzer. The 8th Mazel is Neitzer, and that's the source of Chochma. The 13th Mazel is Venake, which is the source of Bina. And Moshe Rabbeinu was able to join Chochma of Kesed to Chochma of Atzilus. V'hainu, in other words, Milamayla Minai Hishtalshalos, that Moshe Rabbeinu can defy the order and bring into Hishtalshalos godliness which is beyond Hishtalshalos. And the Rabbi explains what he means. We understand the principle of a chain reaction of levels and stages. Derech Mashal, for example, Shemei Chochma, when a person first understands something intuitively and intellectually, Nasa Havana, he can then understand it more thoroughly. And from his thorough understanding comes Umides, his passions. Umimides Machshava, and from his passions he thinks practically about it, v'chuli, and so forth. And in the framework of the chain reaction of steps, called Hishtalshalos, Varelef Yerech HaHishtalshalos, within the parameters of Hishtalshalos, Rachik Hiruchnis Megashmis, the material and the spiritual are removed. Like the distance between a physical act versus the speaking of words, which is considered, relatively speaking, spiritual. And inasmuch as this is concerned, Atzilus is godly, Asiyah is physical, and you cannot bring Atzilus to Asiyah without modification, without simsum. But one has access to the godliness which is beyond the limitations of the chain reaction of worlds. It's so incomparable, it's so quantum separated from all of Hishtalshalos, and therefore, line 31 now, the spiritual and the physical are identical. And Moshe Rabbeinu, because he comes min Amayim Mishisihu, he comes from Shemitah Rishona, he comes from Kesed, has the ability to bring together opposites. And if I understand it correctly, Moshe is unique. In other words, the shamas that exist in this framework of creation all come from Adam Rishon, all come from Atzilus. Now there are neshamas that come from higher, but they are very high, but they're not deep. What Moshe Rabbeinu was unique about is that although his neshama comes from a very, very high level, he was nevertheless a very deep neshama. The qualification or the strength that Moshe Rabbeinu possesses that allows him to bring an Ein Sof, which is beyond the limitations of the infinity of Atzilus, and therefore to which Atzilus and Asi are equal, and he can therefore bring down godliness till this world, has to do with the attribute or the idea of ma, bitl. Now, the word ma, of course, has many connotations. Frequently, the word ma is associated with the divine name, Havaya, because, as you know, I'm sure, if you were to write out the 4 letters Yud K Vav K, you can spell the Vav and the Hey in so many different ways to create all kinds of numerical equivalencies, what's called milui. And if you spell them with an aleph, so it becomes Hey Aleph, and then Vav Aleph Vav, and then Hey Aleph, so it adds up to 45. 26 is the initial letters, Yud K Vav K, and of course the Vav Dalet of the Yud makes it 36. The Aleph of the Hey and the Aleph of the second Hey makes it 38. And then you have an Aleph and a Vav, which is 7 of the Vav, which makes it 45. And it so happens that Ma is the numerical equivalent of Adam, which means man, as opposed to animal. But in Kabbalah and Chassidus, when they talk about Ma, which the Rebbe here translates bittul, there are 2 priorities. Ma is godliness. But the godliness of Ma is unique, first of all, because it's very, very deep. It's atzmi. It's godliness that exists in a modest and in a deep way. But at the same time, it's ma, because of its depth, that's actually contained within the limitations of Adam. In other words, there's godliness which is very, very high. Like, to give you an example, what's called in Chassidus an Iyad Chochmah, one who can see metaphysics, see spiritually. It's a very high level. But seeing is going past being human, because when you see something, it's overwhelming, it's enchanting, but you're not able to internalize it. What is unique about Ma is that as potent and as deep as it is internal. And that's what's so special about Moshe Rabbeinu, that as great as the person he was a person in all of the positive senses of the word. But at the heart of it lies this bittul, as the Maamar calls it, that brings together the absolute etzem of Ein Sof and the idea of Pnimius. And therefore the Pasuk continues and the Rebbe continues and he says, K'mesha Kosov, Ki Kel Deis Havaya. We know that there's a concept of various deis, I'll explain it momentarily, and there is Havaya, God Almighty, to whom all the deis are one. That there are beis deis, there are 2 perspectives. Shemal Mata Lamailo, from the bottom up. Shava Kamei Malmaila Lamata, there's also from the top down, which are 2 different approaches. But because of Havaya or Ma, these 2 become equal. She'eni Tefes Mokam, the differences become inconsequential. You know, there's our opinion of reality and there's God's opinion of reality. Now, of course, when we say our opinion of reality, we mean our opinion of reality as Jews, as believers. So, our opinion of reality as Jews and as believers involves creator and purpose, naturally. And of course, God's opinion of reality involves creator and purpose. But from our perspective, we exist and serve God. And from God's perspective, God exists and we are simply expressions of Him. So although from both points of view, there's God and godliness and a purpose, from our point of view, we exist and He exists. From God's point of view, He exists and we're essentially an expression of Him. So these are 2 levels. And Havaya joins together the Beis Deis. In other words, the Ma, the Bittul, the essence of godliness, which is represented by Moshe Rabbeinu's personality, affects that the point of view that says there is a world that serves God and the point of view that says there's nothing other than God are fused and merged. Let me make a comment here, to try perhaps and illustrate what Ma means. The Tzemach Tzedek was asked once, the way the story is told in the Likutei Devarim is, the Tzemach Tzedek used to have Shavuos, a tish, a table full of Rabbonim, the greatest rabbis of Russia, some of whom were incredible Talmidei Chacham and Goinim, were Chassidim. And they would come to the Tzemach Tzedek for Shavuos. As the Rebbe loved to say, Shavuos was always called Chag HaMatzos, and it didn't mean bread, it meant Meidei Tzedek, rabbis. And there was a tish, there was a special tish that was called the Nigla Tish, which was exclusive for the Rabbonim on the first day of Shavuos, where they would eat milchiks, and the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rabbonim would discuss Nigla. So the story is that somebody once asked the Tzemach Tzedek, what was Moshe Rabbeinu doing when the sea split? What was Moshe Rabbeinu doing at Kriyas Yamsuf? And the Tzemach Tzedek responded and said, "Er is given kalten brand," which means he was hot ice. In other words, if you would have seen how Moshe Rabbeinu stood as the Yam Suf split, you would have seen absolutely nothing on the outside. To the degree that you would have been left with the impression that he wasn't impressed by the great revelation. When in reality, the impression on him was so powerful that he was beyond reaction. It's like if you see two tzaddikim, two true tzaddikim, and one is very passionate and one is very quiet, it isn't necessarily true that the more passionate tzaddik, the more demonstratively passionate tzaddik is on the higher level, because passion is a symbol or a symptom of an inner conflict. The passion is two forces fighting with one another like water and fire and heat. The tzaddik who's quiet and deep is because there's complete peace within him. It doesn't demonstrate a lack of power or potency or depth. It simply represents a peace and a lack of conflict. Moshe Rabbeinu's Moshe Rabbeinu's bittul, that allows him to bring together Atzilus and Asiyah in an equal measure, has to do with this depth, this very atzmiyisdika quality, which also is a very pnimiyisdika quality, which was unique to Moshe Rabbeinu. V'lachein, therefore, line 33, him sheched insaf had the ability to bring down godliness in an equal way, gam ba'asiyah, also into action, ube mitzvahs ma'asis, doing physical mitzvahs. True, Mesu Maisris, the part that was given to the Kohen, the part that was given to the Levi, Moshe Rabbeinu was able to bring the same godliness which exists in Atzilus into these physical things that were vessels for godliness by being used in the performance of a mitzvah. And he brings a philosophical or a mystical allusion to this. That we know Inyan Eifim B'Teich. In Kabbalah, there's a concept of the Malachim called Eifanim. Eifanim means wheels. Circular angels. Now, of course, when you have a wheel, it has a top and a bottom. And if you have a wheel within a wheel, the inner wheel at its lower end is not as low as the outer wheel at its lower end. But alternatively, the inner wheel at its higher end is not as high as the outer wheel at its higher end. In other words, the more encompassing the wheel is, the lower it can descend and the higher it can be. The less encompassing the wheel is, the less it'll lower descend and the higher it will ascend. The higher the wheel, the lower it will descend and the higher it will ascend. The evidence for this is those angels called Eifanim that exist in Asiyah, that those who descend lower have a higher source. Aval, but to be sure, this is true also in Atzilus and in Ein Sof. And Moshe Rabbeinu's ability to make Atzilus and Asiyah equal is because of this model of Eifanim, because it's such a high point at the top, it descends to a much lower point at the bottom. It says that Rabbi de bittul zeh, because of this unique bittul that was special to Moshe Rabbeinu, nasu v'lei techalel of a game, there shouldn't be any chilul. In other words, there should be nothing in God's world that is ordinary, that is unholy. That even this so-called lowly physical world is not choil, is not ordinary in relationship with God, but to use a classic yeshivish term, it's chulin al taras hakedesh, even this world's ordinariness is sanctified. To be sure, from the point of view of God, everything is godly. Prior to creation, and after the days of creation, it's all equal, as well as during the days of creation, when you have access to the absolute truth. Creation is not choil. There's no aspect of God's world which is outside of the truth of God and outside the absolute truth of God, if you're an absolutely connected person. As Moshe Rabbeinu was. Moshe is distinct. Moshe Rabbeinu is the idea of Ma. And again, as opposed to Avraham Avinu. And the Rebbe continues and he says in line 37, and this measure of bittul explains Lomad Rav Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda learned on such a level that the fear of his master was upon him to such a degree that that he wasn't considered human. There's a Gemara Masechta Nida that is talking about Rabbi Yehuda. And basically what the Gemara is saying is that for most people, there are divisions, There are higher levels of being a person, there's lower levels of being a person, and then there's the lowest levels of being people. And clearly, for most people, when we do our very, very parochial, ordinary things, we're involved in lower things, then we're involved in more lofty things. And as a result, there are rules that govern the divisions, the separations, or the safety measures that are installed by the Chazal to keep us as we're supposed to be. Since all of us have to, for example, use the bathroom, and there's nothing very sanctified about using the bathroom. There are rules about how that should be done so that it shouldn't be in conflict, it shouldn't be in opposition to our more lofty selves. But the Gemara says Rabbi Yehuda wasn't human, and his lack of humanness expressed itself not in his holiness, but in the fact that in his world there was no difference between the most lofty and sublime and holy and the most parochial and even lowly of aspects of his being, because for some reason Rabbi Yehuda was tuned into this dimension, which our Maamar is calling Moshe Rabbeinu Ma, which is so above that to it Atzilus and Asiya are equal. Which explains why Rabbi Yehuda was parted from davening, which is of course the level that we call in the Gemara Teirasa Yom Nasei, a person whose whole identity is Torah. Now think about it. Nobody can eat a blat Gemara. People whose Teirasa Yom Nasei means exactly that. That's all they did was study. Well, how do you make parnasa from learning Torah? And the answer is, if you're Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, if you're Rabbi ben Shimon, if you're Rabbi Yehuda, the parnasa just comes. Because in the world of these people, Asiya and Atzilus are equal. And therefore, there's no conflict, there's no inconsistency, there's no disparity between their Atzilus lives and their Asiya lives. The Gemara tells us an interesting exchange that's brought, of course, in Chassidus between a Maamar and a certain heretic who made a claim that the human being is divided in two. The upper person is godly and the lower person is the devil. So the Gemara says, in Masechta Shabbos, Anei Kisil Be'ival Tebe Teira. That when somebody says something foolish about Yiddishkeit, you have to answer. And when somebody says something foolish, B'dvarim B'teilim, you shouldn't bother. So a Maamar meets this min, and he says something utterly foolish, that a human being is divided in two. The upper half is the realm of God, the lower half is the realm of the devil, and they're separate. So he answers him. But he answers him Be'ivalta. He answers this heretic as the heretic should be answered. And he tells him, if a person is split, and the upper portion of the person is divine, and the lower portion of the person is beast, how does the beast allow the man, the human being, to allow water to pass through his domain? In other words, the way God designed human beings, we excrete, we give out waste from the lower portions of ourselves. And why would the beast allow the human being to dispose of its waste through itself? This was a, if you will, almost cynical way of speaking the language of this heretic, responding in kind. And his point was, of course, we're not split, we're not two, there's an upper and lower person, but rather all of us are integrated in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But still, even if we believe in Achdus, and we say that there is a higher, that the human being is entirely integrated, and the lower portion of the body that's involved in the more menial aspects of existence, and the loftier, the higher portion of the body that's involved in the more lofty things are integrated, there's still rules, there's still mechitzas, there's still criteria. In the case of Rabbi Yehuda, there were no rules. It was one constant. He was so tuned in to godliness that even the most ordinary things were for him a part of that in-tuneness. I'll tell you a story for which I'm going to get into trouble. There was a Heilige Kalaver Rebbe, Isaac Kalaver, who was one of the great tzaddikim who brought Chassidus to Hungary way back in the times of the Alter Rebbe. So I heard from somebody who knows. The Kalav had terribly sensitive skin. And any kind of clothing was abrasive. It would literally scratch him, cut him. And he suffered a lot. So when he was alone, he would sometimes take off his clothes. And his Gabbai walked in, and he found his Rebbe in a state of undress that for most people would be embarrassing. and he wanted to leave. He didn't know how to react. It seemed very unnatural to him. And the Kalava told him, come here, don't run away from me. Vizeyechos, how do I look to you? So, what's he supposed to tell his Rebbe? He says, V'yodam erishin farenchet. He says, you look to me like Adam before the original sin. And his Rebbe said, emes. True. You know, in the Gemara we read about Rabbi Chanin ben Doisa and his Rebbetzin. They were so poor that between them they shared one outfit. Between the two of them, they shared one outfit. So when she had to go to the market, he had to stay home. He had no clothes. And when he had to go to the yeshiva, she had to stay home because she had no clothes. And of course the question becomes, how could a couple live like that? There's no tznius and so forth. And it's brought in Sfarim that they lived in a state of Adam and Chav before the Chet. This is what's being described here. A person for whom not only is it integration between higher and lower, there's simply no high and no low. It's all the same. This was the Madreg of Moshe Rabbeinu. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu has the ability to bring together, if you will, Atzilus and Asiyah to the degree that they're the same. V'hine, and I'm reading on. Breaking it down more. Aidelim with that Torah, the Torah that Rabbi Yehuda does, or that Moshe Rabbeinu does, bebittelzeh, with this special tool called Mamshech Pnimius, brings down the so-called essence of godliness to be manifest internally by the mitzvahs. And through the performance of mitzvahs, Makiv, Mulavushim, you bring down this special power in an indirect way, which are bringing godliness down to Asiyah in the level of Ma, which means how godliness permeates and penetrates, and Ban, how godliness embraces. And alternatively, this is the idea of the name Hashem and the name Elikim also become representative of Ma and Ban. Havaya is Ma, the divine name. Havaya goes on Ma, and Elikecha goes on Ban. Eichel is like a fire. Kemoshel, for example, on Nason Eish Savava Kliyo B'Techa V'Chuli, you have a fire, and you put a vessel into the fire, you will see the vessel being surrounded by the fire, and you also see what looks like the fire being inside the vessel, Vidal. And the Nimshal is at this level of Moshe Rabbeinu that makes Asiyah, Atzilus and Asiyah Shava, the Ma aspect of it is penetrating, the Ban aspect of it is encompassing. In short, what we have learned is that Moshe is very different than Avraham. Because Moshe comes from a space where there are no worlds. I mean, there are worlds, but the worlds are not absolutely divided. And therefore, the godliness of the highest world can be brought all the way down to the lowest world. Now we get back to the Maamar, to the Pasuk. And let me just give you an example as a way of bringing this a little bit closer to us. In the Pasuk in Shir HaShirim describes the Jewish people as being Biti, the daughter of God, Achoisi, the sister of God, and Imi, the mother of God. Now it's kind of hard to fathom the Jewish people being the mother of God. So of course in Chassidishe and in Kabbalah these ideas are all explained, that godliness is Zoh, the Eir Anpin, but the godliness is in the world of Adam, of Atzilus, Ponim, and Bas would be Malchus, Achoisi would be Zoh, and Imi would be Bina. In other words, when you're talking about levels of godliness, not God, Chas v'sholom, levels of godliness, there is an idea where Kvayachal Yidden stand higher than Adam Helyon, higher than Zoh. And this is the same idea that we have here. Because Moshe Rabbeinu is this theme of Ma, and let me repeat that Ma on the one hand makes Moshe Adam human, but at the same time, the Adam comes from such a deep place of bittul and quiescence and transcendence that there is no divisions. This places Moshe Rabbeinu higher than godliness. And the Rebbe says, V'zehu, line 40, this is the meaning of the pasuk. Moshe Yedaber, Moshe speaks, and forgive me for incorporating the words here, V'olikim ya'anenu, and godliness responds to Moshe, because from the level of Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama, he stands higher than the divine name Elikim, which we explained in the previous paragraph very briefly to be Ban, lower. So usually you would imagine God speaks and man responds. Here you have man speaking and godliness responding, because the man is Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu's neshama is a level of godliness which is so exalted that, in fact, he stands higher than Elokim, and Elokim is responding to Moshe. That's the gist of the pshat of this pasuk that his Maamar will now explain to us. That Moshe Yedaber Moshe speaks, and the words of Moshe come from the top down. Because Moshe Rabbeinu has this incredible bittul to Hashem, but at the same time, this bittul has a depth and a pnimius of Adam, which allows it to be brought into the world in an absolute way, and yet, so to speak, fit into the world. It brings godliness also at the level of asiyah, and it remains the absolute godliness, and asiyah is able to receive it. Did we not explain last week that Avraham also brings godliness from the higher worlds to the lower worlds, but as Avraham brings them from the higher worlds to the lower worlds, they're modified and changed and diminished. How does Avraham achieve this? With his own personal passions. And consequently, his passions are measured, and the godliness which is being brought forward by them is accordingly measured. True. He brings it first into Atzilus, and then he brings it down into Asiyah. It's his own personal service that allows him to bring godliness from a higher level to a lower level, and therefore it's limited. As opposed to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu brings godliness through the gift of the Torah, which is which is an absolute gift. Which is the wisdom of God. And the power that Moshe Rabbeinu has to bring godliness to Asiyah using Torah and mitzvahs, who nimshach gam lamata, brings godliness to this world as well. The fire should inspire from the inside and the outside, to completely transform and destroy the animal soul. What is the end and ultimate purpose of why God created higher worlds and lower worlds, and arranges for us to bring godliness from the higher levels to the lower levels? The ultimate answer is that there shouldn't be higher and lower. That it should be realized in the future. The righteous will one day be called holy. And the Rebbe translates Lifnei Kaddish, it should be higher than Kedusha. She is haper b'yala Atzilus, that there should be no separation between B'riyah Yitzir and Asiyah and Atzilus. In other words, it isn't only there should be godliness brought even to the lower worlds, but that the godliness brought to the lower world is the same as the godliness is brought to Atzilus, because they are Lifnei Kaddish. They're higher than the Madrega of Elokus of Atzilus, than the Madrega of Kedesh Mila B'Gamei, which is Chachma, which is Kesed. The heavens, as we know them, are going to be destroyed, and there will be Shamayim Chadashim, Eretz Chadashim, a new heaven and a new earth. And what is the new heaven? Shamayim Chadashim is Raz and Deraisa V'Chulu. The new heavens is an allusion to the secrets of the Torah. The Hainu, what this means, not Atzilus, but higher than Atzilus, and therefore Shalayi Yepnimisam Akifim Dibyakim the Atzilus, that in this, the lowest world, there will be not only a godliness which is perhaps greater than, but measured relative to, these the lower worlds, but in simple words, Atzilus and Asiyah are going to be equal. So Moshe Rabbeinu represents this koyach of bringing godliness from such a high point, where the idea of high and low is erased. And accordingly, the Torah says, V'zehu v'alakim yanenu. Elokim Lashon Srar, Elokim goes on Malchus, a lower level, and Moshe speaks, and Elokim responds. Elokim Lashon Srar, Moshe Kosta Betanya B'Chinuch Katan. Hainu, what does this mean in other words? That there's Malchus, the B'riyah Yitzir and Asiyah, Malchus of Atzilus, which is prepared for the lower worlds. Sham, in Malchus, who Hamshachas HaTeira, the Teira is brought down also, Zroyim Chesed Denukva V'Chulu, and Elokim, which is Malchus, is responding to Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, the godliness of Atzilus, which comes into the lower worlds now, comes into the lower worlds in such a way that in the lower worlds it's less than Atzilus, while Moshe Rabbeinu brings a godliness to whom there is no difference between the godliness of Atzilus and the lower worlds, and therefore this godliness is responding to Moshe Rabbeinu. And that's the meaning of the word Yanenu Lashon Oinuhu, that the godliness of Atzilus is responding to Moshe Rabbeinu. K'maimer Azal, Eina Achareya, Mashehein Eimin, V'chulu, they're responding after him what Moshe Rabbeinu was saying. V'inyan Yanenu, and the idea that the lower worlds are responding to Moshe Rabbeinu means Shekshem Shemam Shech Bechinas Moshe, just as the level of Moshe Rabbeinu brings forth Bechinas Bittul. And because of this Bittul, this Bechinas V'leises Chalalu V'chulu, there's no such thing as ordinary, even Asiyas Elokus. To bring down the infinite godliness to whom Atzilus and Asiyah are equal. But Malchus, the Beyond Malchus, and through it into the lower worlds, Malchus and the lower worlds respond in kind, to transform the lower worlds as well, that the lower worlds should be equal to Atzilus. Torah is bringing godliness to Malchus, and the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu brings forward is such a Torah that affects that the lower worlds become equal to Atzilus. So Moshe Rabbeinu brings on this very lofty koyach, or level, which equalizes Atzilus and Asiyah, and the worlds, or Malchus, or Elikim, respond to Moshe Rabbeinu by making themselves equal to the inspiration that Moshe Rabbeinu gives them. So if you wanted to read the pasuk, you would say Moshe Yedaber. Moshe brings forth a Torah, a atzmos of godliness, to whom Atzilus and Asiyah are equal. V'alakim, and the godliness of the lower worlds, Yanenu, respond in kind, that they make themselves aligned with the inspiration that Moshe provides, so that even in the lowest world, you not only have godliness also, but you have godliness in a way that is equal to the godliness that exists even in the highest worlds. And the Rebbe, so to speak, links it to other discussions. Amru, we find that says in Kabbalah, and this is not new, you had these contradictions all over the Tanya, and there's footnotes of the Rebbe on it, that sometimes you say that the lowest level of Torah is only in Atzilus, and doesn't come to the lower world, and sometimes you say the lowest level of Torah reaches all the way to Asiyah. And it says like this, Talmud b'Briya, the Gemara is only in the world of Briya. U'Mishnah b'Yetzirah, Mishnah is in the world of Yetzirah. U'Mikra and Tanakh is b'Asiyah. U'Lachayre, and you move, and the question is, V'alei Mikra Yesa Naila, is it not true that Mikra, Torah Shebeksav, is higher than Mishnah? Not lower than Mishnah? So what do you mean when you say Mikra comes till Asiyah? And the answer, of course, is, El Dekoya Lam Shacha Shabim Mikra, that Mam Shachad Asiyah. When you say that Mikra comes in Asiyah, doesn't mean it comes in Asiyah only, but it comes in Asiyah also. In other words, the godliness of the Chumash, the godliness of the Torah Shebeksav, is such that you see that it is godly even in this world. While the godliness of Mishnah, you see its godliness only in Yetzirah, and down here it's just ideas. And the godliness of Talmud, which is more convoluted, more complicated, is only identified as such in Briya. And of course, because Mikra has a higher source in Atzilus, it's godly also down here. This is the meaning of the Maamar Chazal, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Sheina Kenegdi. Now let's talk this over. There's a Maamar Chazal called HaKoyre V'Sheina HaKadosh Baruch Hu Koyre V'Sheina Kenegdi. Right? What does that mean? A person who reads Mikra or reads Mishnah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Koyre V'Sheina Kenegdi, reads Mikra and Mishnah opposite them. Now how is this understood in convention? In convention it means, when we learn Torah, if you will, God acts as our chavrusa. He speaks along with us. We speak first and he speaks second. But of course, the presumption is we are down here, tiny little people, and the HaKadosh Baruch Hu is up there, godliness, and our small Torah down here is reciprocated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Here the Rebbe is going to explain this Maamar Chazal in the spirit of the pasuk. Moshe Yedaber v'Elikim Yanenu. Moshe, Adam Ma, is higher than Elikim. He speaks and Elikim responds. So accordingly, Kol HaKoyre V'Sheina, which goes on Adam, Moshe Rabbeinu. They read Mikra and Mishnah first, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu Koyre V'Sheina Kenegdi is lower than the Adam, which is Koyre V'Sheina. Let's read it inside. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Nikra Malchus. HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this case goes on Malchus. Gamkein. Shu Baruch v'nimshach lamata b'malchus, because the idea of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is godliness that comes down to Malchus or to the lower world. V'sheina kenegdi, and it's responding opposite him, he had Torah, which is Adam, Moshe, Zah. So the Koyre v'sheina is higher than HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is responding. Just as we said, Moshe Yedaber, and V'Elikim, godliness is responding to Moshe, now it's Adam, Koyre v'sheina, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu Koyre v'sheina kenegdi. which is brought down into him, which is the same idea as godliness responding to Moshe Rabbeinu. In Atzilus, you cannot speak of Hashem responding to Atzilus. Teira already exists there. There's no change in godliness, and therefore Teira in Atzilus already exists. Teira comes down from Atzilus. So what does it mean that when a person is Kedev V'Sheina Kadosh Baruch Hu Kedev V'Sheina Kenegdi Ela Malchus? Teira is higher than Malchus. And when we relearn Teira, we bring down Teira from Atzilus to Malchus, and Malchus responds. You know what it reminds me of, like you have in the Maamorim, on Achilas Adam and Achilas Mizbeach. Karbonis involved a portion that was eaten by the Kohen and a portion that was eaten on the Mizbeach. Now, Kohen is a physical human being. Mizbeach is the mouth of God, so to speak. But it says in Maamar Chassidishe that Achilas Adam is Zoh and Achilas Mizbeach is Malchus. The Achilah of the Adam is higher than the Achilas Mizbeach. Similarly, the Kedev V'Sheina is higher than the Kadosh Baruch Hu Kedev V'Sheina Kenegdi. This explains Shenase is Chachus. Something new is initiated that Kadosh Baruch Hu Sheina Kenegdi V'Chul. And of course, what's unique about Moshe Rabbeinu's Moshe Yedaber and all Akim Yanenu, that Moshe brings godliness from such a place where the differences between high and low are erased. Now, one more detail that the Rebbe analyzes in the pasuk. We explained Moshe Yedaber. Moshe is higher than Elokim, and Elokim Yanenu means the godliness of the lower worlds respond to Moshe. But then it says the word bekoil, with voice. So it says bekeli shal Moshe. Moshe Yedaber Elokim Yanenu. The Elokim Yanenu was with the voice of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, of course, in Pshutei shal Mikra, what does this mean? Hashem was Moshe Rabbeinu's amplifier. Hashem speaks, Moshe repeats, and God amplifies. Moshe Rabbeinu was speaking to several million people, and I guess it's kind of difficult to speak to several million people with the best skills as an orator, and Moshe Rabbeinu, as you know, wasn't particularly blessed in that way. So Elokim Yanenu B'Kol, God gave him voice. But it says in Chazal that God gave him his own voice. In other words, God amplified the sound of Moshe's own voice. What's the mysticism of this? That the voice is that of Moshe, not of Elokim. According to Chassidus, voice, sound comes from the heart. In other words, passions are the source of words. That according to one's bittul or passion, the quality of one's speech reflects one's passion. In other words, you wouldn't compare the godliness brought down by the Torah of Rabbi Yehuda, who was called before Ein Ze Yeludish, and the Torah of Rashbi, who's Terasayim Nasei, down to our own. That Agam Shekulam Leimdim Tzrufi Eisius Heimatzma, we're all saying the same words and exhaling the same air. Nevertheless, the difference is not in the sound, the difference is in the passion, in the heart, which is the source of that voice. Ha'amshacha, hi mishtana, the qualitative effect of the words spoken, changes lefi ha'bitl v'chol v'dal, depending on one's degree of bitl. So Moshe brings down godliness, and Olakim Yanenu, Olakim responds, Bekoil, with the bitl of Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, with the passions behind the words of Moshe Rabbeinu, that makes the Olakim Yanenu much more whole, much more complete. So this Maamar does in effect two things. It explains the difference between Avraham and Moshe, and explains the pasuk, how Moshe is higher than Elokim, and Elokim is responding to Moshe Rabbeinu. Now let me finish with a story. In light of what we just said, you know the Rebbe Marash, that he lived a life of Lechatchila Riber. Right? The Rebbe would very frequently make allusions, reference to Lechatchila Riber. And of course it's based on a letter from the previous Rebbe where he quotes the Rebbe Marash as having said, Unich Zog Lechatchila Riber. The Rebbe must have said it hundreds, perhaps thousands of times. The previous Rebbe may have quoted him once. But if you read the biography of the Rebbe Marash, you discover that whether he said it often or not, that's not the point. He lived that way. There's no question about it. And one of the more extreme stories of the Rebbe Marash was that in the early 1880s there were pogroms all over Russia. And of course, if you know the history of Tsarist Russia, the pogroms were orchestrated from the highest levels of government as a distraction. Right? The Russian citizenry, the Russian peasants, were most displeased. They were most disenfranchised because the government was truly unfair. And whenever the government feared revolution, they needed to keep the people busy and distracted. And of course, one of the greatest techniques was, what they used to call in Rome, bread and circuses. In Russia, they called it pogroms. I hate to say it. So in the early 1880s, there were such pogroms. Many, many Jews immigrated from Russia to America, to Israel, and so forth, as you know, I'm sure. The Rebbe Marash contemplated leaving Russia. He decided to stay. I don't want to go into the details. But he pulled off one of the greatest acts of blackmail. He came to Petersburg in 1882. And there's a lot of details to the story where he met a bunch of Jewish lay leaders, some of which were not religious, and he told them what to do, and they sort of let him know that they're not his Chassidim. He can't just push them around. He can't tell them what to do. He has to consult with them. And the Rebbe Marash told them, I'm giving you a chance to do a mitzvah. Take it, or I'll do it myself. Like Mordechai said to Esther, Revach v'atzola yamed laYehudim mimoka machar v'atu beisovich tevedu. You have an opportunity to help your Jewish brethren, but if you're too arrogant and too stuck up and believe yourself above, the solution, the resolution, the salvation will come from someplace else, and you'll end up being lost. So he came to the capital. He met the Russian higher-ups, and he had a difficult time getting a hold of them, and he put pressure on them about the pogroms, and they diplomatically told him they would see what they could do. And it was very obvious that they were not interested in stopping the pogroms. So the Rebbe Marash did the coolest thing in the world. He got on a train and traveled to the west. He went to Paris, went to Berlin, and within days, in the greatest Western European newspapers, there were huge, huge exposés, op-eds, opinion pieces, accusing the Russian government of anti-Semitism and violence against the Jews, and there were proposals of sanctions against Russia, which would have cost the government and the economy in Russia severely. The Rebbe Marash got back on a train and went straight back to Petersburg. When he arrived in Petersburg, he didn't wait in line for any appointments. They came looking for him, and they were livid, furious. And he met, I think, the Sar HaChutz, the Secretary of State, who was beside himself with rage. You realize you've undermined the government. For this, you can lose your life. And the Rebbe Marash said, I'm not going to sit by and watch Jewish blood be spilled and do nothing. And he in fact told the Rebbe Marash, you could lose your head for this. And the Rebbe Marash used the expression, wegen sich trachte ich im Ganzen nicht, which means in English, I'm not thinking of myself at all. Now this wegen sich trachte ich im Ganzen nicht can be understood in two ways. One way is he was prepared to lose his life, and he in fact passed away the following Tishrei, and in the now published diary of our Rebbe, it's been discovered that he said that he's going to give his life for the pogroms to stop. But another version of it is, you can't touch me. I'm not afraid. Wegen sich trachte ich im Ganzen nicht means to say, I am above your sphere of influence. You cannot touch me, and I don't fear for my life, and I'll do what I need to do to protect the Jewish people. And in light of this Maamar, the second pshat works better. That the Rebbe Marash is saying, from the position that I am, you simply cannot touch me. And this is what Moshe Rabbeinu's idea is. To him, Atzilus and Asiyah were Shavah. Now, of course, how do you deal with a Maamar like this? We're not Moshe Rabbeinu, we're not Avraham Avinu, we're pipsqueaks. And the only useful answer is connection to the tzaddik. You know, you shouldn't think that because you're around the tzaddik, you are the tzaddik. We're not. We're little tiny people. But when you have a connection to a tzaddik, you have those incredible koiches that a tzaddik gives to be more than we would otherwise be because of this connection. And perhaps even more than we would otherwise be in such a way that allows us to bridge the sublime and the ordinary, the spiritual and the material.